Minor Detail by Palestinian author Adania Shibli was translated into English from the Arabic by Elizabeth Jacquet, and it was published in English by Fitzcarraldo Editions back in 2020. I've had this book on my radar since it appeared on the International Booker Prize longlist in 2021. But like a lot of other people, I have been spurred into finally reading it right now because of the genocide that is currently being committed against the Palestinian people of Gaza. If you're interested in reading more Palestinian works in translation, I also hugely recommend The Sea Cloak by Newroz Karmout, translated from the Arabic by Perween Richards. That is a fantastic short story collection. Talking about the literature and art of Palestinian people in the face of occupation, apartheid, and genocide somehow feels kind of small. But it's important to celebrate the works of an oppressed people. And Minor Detail is a very, very important short novel that everybody needs to read right now. I actually buddy read this book with my friend Amber, and so as I go through this review, I'm going to include some of her thoughts as well, with her permission. Minor Detail is a 100-page novella neatly separated into two equally sized, interconnected stories. The first story takes place in the summer of 1949, shortly after the Nakba. Nakba is Arabic for catastrophe, and this catastrophe led to the displacement of more than half of Palestine's people, in what Israel called their war for independence. The second story is set in the modern day, with a Palestinian journalist reading an article about the events of the first story and becoming obsessed with it, and searching for the truth of it. That first story is told from the perspective of an Israeli soldier, which is something that I did not expect, but turns out to be incredibly effective. This Israeli soldier is one of many who are patrolling the desert, and we spend pages upon pages just following him around as he patrols, and at one point he is bitten by a bug, and that bite starts to fester and rot, and it's graphic. This soldier soon finds a group of Bedouin Arabs. He opens fire, kills them all, including their camels, but one girl survives. One young woman whom he takes, and I can't say on YouTube what he does to her, but the fact that I can't say it should be enough to reveal what he does to her. And he does it several times. He takes her back to his tent, and he keeps her there for several days, until he and his platoon kill and bury her. This, as it turns out, is a true story of something that really happened in 1949. And it's what, as the title plays on, is referred to as a minor detail. As I said, the novel's second half follows a modern-day Palestinian woman. She has read an article by an Israeli journalist that covers the events of the first half of the book, but she's not happy with the details. She's not happy with what is covered there. So she actually calls him up, and he says, "Everything I know is in the article. I omitted nothing." And so she sets out on a journey. She goes to several museums, talks to multiple people, and she wants to find more details. She wants to find the truth of it. And we follow her along on that journey through the second half of the book. Minor Detail is a very simple book in terms of its events and its plot. But where it succeeds, what makes it such a perfectly crafted and finely honed short novel, is the language and structure of it, and the prosaic choices that Shibli has made in her writing. After we read it, Amber and I were discussing the book, and she brought up some fantastic points that I'm going to read out to you. The parallel between the first story and the next is nuanced. The narrator of the second part mirrors some of the action of the soldiers from part one, driving endlessly round the same landscape, but her intention is to do it to uncover the life of his victim. It's ultimately a cyclical book, because occupation, war, and genocide is sadly cyclical. At every sentence, with every word choice, the language reminds us of occupation, settlement, penetration, infiltration, etc. The language that Shibli uses is quite incredible. There are a lot of motifs and metaphorical choices that are used in both halves of the book to reflect the concepts of occupation and apartheid, and war and aggression and murder. For example, in the first half, while the Israeli soldier is doing what he does to this Arab woman, there is the sound of a dog barking. That dog barks multiple times throughout that story. And when we enter the second story, our protagonist is kind of plagued by this barking dog on her street. And as she gets towards the end of her story, a dog pops up again. The implication of the dog is vague, but my reading of it is dehumanization, the objectifying and dehumanizing of the women in this story. A dog barking is animalistic in its imagery and its sound. It sounds aggressive. It sounds kind of feral. And the fact that it appears at very specific moments, I think, reflects the idea of the dehumanization of the Palestinian people. Imagery like this abounds in this really short novel, making it very, very dense and thought-provoking. But some things are a lot more obvious. For example, as I said, that first story follows an Israeli soldier. It's written in the third person, but he is still our perspective character. The Bedouin woman never speaks. He puts his hand over her mouth several times. She has no dialogue. She has no agency. We never see inside of her mind. We know nothing about her. She's never named. She is entirely objectified within the narrative. However, in the second half, we switch to the first person and the present tense, as we spend that entire story in the mind of a living, breathing woman, and we read and we hear all of her thoughts, all of her feelings, all of the time. She is constantly telling us what she thinks about so many things. Everything she sees, we see. But on almost every single page, she will flash back in some way. Something she sees will remind her of something. She will tell us that memory because we're just living in her brain, and that means we get to know her a little bit better. We get to know her personality, her past, her work, her living situation, everything. She not only is our perspective character, but she very viscerally reflects the situation in the first half of the story. An anonymous Arab woman being dehumanized and objectified. It's a stark contrast and it works beautifully to remind the reader of the treatment of Palestinian people, the occupation, the apartheid, and the very obvious truth that Palestinian people are in fact humans. In our conversation, Amber also brought up borders as a motif as well. She said, I really like the discussion on borders. Borders not just being physical, but actually more importantly, they are mental and emotional borders. In the book's second half, our protagonist immediately remarks on borders and how she sees them. How the concept of borders, the carving up of territory, the drawing of lines through physical space, has impacted her mind, impacted how she sees the world around her, impacted her relationships and her day-to-day life. Borders kind of define her and how she sees the world. And then as she travels around, she moves from place to place, area to area, and she remarks on how the nation and the culture in which she lives has been divided up, carved up. Military occupation is loud and aggressive in this story. Minor Detail is one of those books where every single word has been chosen very specifically. Elizabeth Jacquet's translation is staggering. The ways in which she has carried the weight of those individual words and made sure that nothing is lost. Everything is preserved and everything hits as hard and as uncomfortably as possible. Literature in translation does not exist for English-speaking readers. It is naive and arrogant for us to think that it does. Authors write in their own languages, and when things get translated, we are lucky enough and privileged enough to get to read them. That said, this certainly feels like a book that is particularly important for non-Arabic, non-Palestinian people to read. It's an eye-opening book in a political sense, and a vitally moving piece of work in a human sense. There's a lot more that I could say about it, but I urge you to go and read this book for yourself. It is not an easy read. It will upset and distress you in multiple different ways. And while I take trigger warnings very, very seriously and I don't want to upset any readers, I would argue that in this particular instance it doesn't really matter. Minor Detail needs to be read, partly because we need to be reading, enjoying and celebrating so much Palestinian art and literature right now, and partly because this book in particular sheds a light on the Nakba and the lives of Palestinian people under apartheid and occupation for the past 7 decades. It's a really remarkable novel, and it'll stay with you, and so it should. I really hope you read it. Subscribe for books.